Frank always believed that fear was an eternal chain binding Margaret. For 52 years, he didn't view her as a wife, but merely as a piece of walking furniture, a target for his rage whenever he was drunk. But Frank made a fatal mistake. He failed to realize that even the most submissive silence has its breaking point. A spilled bowl of stew and shattered teeth that afternoon didn't break Margaret. Instead, they became the fuse for a spectacular uprising. You are about to witness how a 74-year-old woman, from the depths of humiliation, stood up to strip everything from the house and assets to the last shred of dignity away from her dictatorial husband in less than 24 hours. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they might shake your beliefs. There are stories that, no matter how painful, must be told. Shut up forever, old woman. Frank's words cut through the morning air like a jagged blade. Margaret, 74 years old, felt the invisible blow in her wrinkled chest. Her trembling hands held the dented coffee pot, the same one she had used during 52 years of marriage. The steam rose slowly, mixing with the heavy silence that filled the kitchen. The old woman didn't answer. She had learned that words only made things worse. Her bare feet moved over the worn linoleum, every step calculated to make no noise. Frank was sitting in his usual chair, with the newspaper spread out like a wall between them. His broad shoulders looked tense under the wrinkled shirt he had worn 3 days in a row. "Did you hear me?" he grunted without looking up from the sports section. Margaret nodded toward her husband's hunched back. Her lips remained sealed like a tomb. The coffee bubbled on the stove like a drowned protest. She poured 2 cups with the precision of someone who has repeated the same ritual thousands of times. Her movements were a dance memorized by fear. Harper appeared in the doorway, fixing her light blue blouse for work. Her eyes avoided her mother's with the skill of someone who has perfected the art of not seeing. At 50 years old, she was still living in the family house, pretending the nightly screams were nightmares that could be ignored until dawn. "Good morning, Dad." Her voice sounded forced, too cheerful for 7 inches the morning. Frank grunted something unintelligible. The newspaper crinkled in his calloused hands like sandpaper. Margaret placed the cup in front of him carefully, as if placing an offering before a vengeful god. A drop of coffee spilled onto the yellow laminate table, forming a perfect brown circle that looked like a dried bloodstain. "Look what you're doing." Frank raised his eyes for the first time that morning. They were small and hard, like black stones polished by hate. "Always just as clumsy, just like your mother." The reference to her dead mother made Margaret feel a stab in her stomach. Frank knew every single one of her weak points and used them like sharp knives. She wiped the drop with a rag she kept in the pocket of her faded apron. Her movements were mechanical, studied over decades of survival. Harper took her handbag and headed for the door. Her heels clicked on the floor like a countdown. She didn't say goodbye to her mother. It was another family tradition, leaving without words to avoid fully waking the monster eating breakfast at the kitchen table. The metal front door closed with a noise that echoed through the whole house. Now they were alone. Margaret felt the air becoming thicker, harder to breathe. It was as if the walls shrank when Harper left, leaving her trapped in an increasingly smaller box. Frank folded the newspaper with calculated violence. The paper crumpled like a stifled scream. His eyes followed Margaret's every movement as she picked up the toast crumbs that had fallen to the floor. It was a silent and minute inspection, looking for the slightest error to justify the explosion they both knew was coming. The old woman felt the weight of that gaze on her back, hunched from years of working in the canning factories. Her knees cracked when she bent down to clean under the table. A solitary tear slid down her wrinkled cheek, but she dried it quickly with the back of her hand before he could see it. "The coffee is cold," Frank murmured with a dangerously calm voice. Margaret straightened up slowly like a plant seeking sunlight. She took the cup and took it back to the stove. Her hands didn't tremble. After so many years, she had learned to control even the slightest gestures. Every muscle in her body knew the choreography of fear, as if she had been born to dance it. Frank slammed the table with his open palm. The sound resonated in the kitchen like a warning shot. The spoons jumped on the plastic placemat. The glasses tinkled like death knells. Margaret didn't flinch. Not anymore. Her nervous system had learned to process violence as background noise. "You're not answering me today," he murmured, getting up from the chair with the heaviness of a bear, waking up in a bad mood. His words remained floating in the morning air, like a threat wrapped in fog. Margaret kept heating the coffee, turning her back to her husband. For the first time that morning, something changed in her tired eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resignation. It was something more dangerous and subtle. It was the first symptom of a disease that Frank didn't know had begun to incubate. The wall clock marked 7:15. The day had officially begun. But for Margaret, something more important had ended forever. Frank's slamming of the door made the plates in the sink tremble like teeth chattering from cold. Margaret waited until the noise of his heavy steps faded down the street, mixing with the sound of the cars taking normal people to their normal jobs. Only then did she allow herself to exhale the air she had been holding in her lungs as if it were poison. The house fell silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes after the storm, when the air still vibrates with echoes of violence, and the walls keep the echo of the screams like cursed recordings. Margaret walked to the kitchen window and pulled back the faded floral curtain she had sewn herself 20 years ago. From the house across the street, Betty was watching her over her red geraniums. The 78-year-old neighbor had the suspicious habit of watering her plants just when the morning screams began at the Miller house. Her sharp eyes didn't miss a detail. Every shove, every scream, every tear was registered in her relentless memory, as if she kept a mental archive of neighborhood tragedies. Margaret let go of the curtain quickly, as if she had touched fire. She didn't want pity. The neighbor's pity was almost as humiliating as Frank's fists. At least the blows lasted seconds. The looks of pity chased her for whole days, constantly reminding her that her private life had become a public spectacle. She returned to the sink and began to wash the breakfast dishes. The hot water turned her cracked hands red, like road maps leading nowhere good. The soap formed bubbles that popped one by one, like small illusions bursting against reality. A memory hit her without warning, as it always happened when she let her guard down. Frank shoving her against the kitchen wall 3 days ago. The bruise on her right shoulder still hurt when she raised her arm to hang the clothes. It had been over salt in the stew. Too much salt, according to him. Although she knew any excuse would have served the same. Another flashback slipped through her mental defenses from the night before. Him screaming at her for leaving the bathroom door ajar. "Do you want the neighbors to see us like animals?" he had roared, as if the problem were the door and not his screams waking up the whole neighborhood. His words had been like shards of glass, cutting away pieces of dignity she could never recover. Harper had turned up the volume on the TV so as not to hear. It was her survival method, making noise to cover up other more painful noises, like playing a sad song so as not to hear the heart weeping. The tears fell into the soapy water, like raindrops on a dirty puddle. Margaret let them fall without trying to stop them. In the empty kitchen, she could afford to cry. It was the only place in the whole house where she could still be human without paying consequences for it. From outside came the sound of a door closing softly. Betty had gone inside her house, but Margaret knew the woman would keep watching from her living room window, hidden behind the lace curtains like a kindly spy. It was comforting and terrifying at the same time. Someone saw what was happening. Someone knew the truth. Someone could testify if one day she didn't survive to tell it. The phone rang with its sharp and annoying ring. Margaret dried her hands on her apron before answering. It was Harper calling from work, as she had done every morning for 5 years. "Are you okay, Mom?" "Yes, my daughter. Dad already left." "Yeah." An uncomfortable silence filled the phone line like dense smoke. Both knew there was much more to say, questions to ask, truths to confess, but words had become dangerous in that family. Better to stay silent and pretend everything was normal, that bruises were accidental falls and screams were normal marriage arguments. "See you tonight," said Harper before hanging up, as if it were a threat disguised as a promise. Margaret hung up the phone and stood looking at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. It is heartbreaking to witness the wall of silence between mother and daughter, a survival tactic that has left them both isolated in the same house. Margaret believes this is just another day of endurance, but she has no idea that the fragile peace she is trying to maintain is hours away from being shattered forever. The deep lines told the complete story of a life of hard work and silent blows. Every scar had a date and reason engraved in her memory. The cut on her thumb when she broke a glass, dodging a slap last year. The circular burn on her wrist when he pushed her against the hot stove during an argument about the electric bill. A noise in the yard startled her like a gunshot. It was just the neighbor's orange cat, climbing the rotting wood fence. But the scare reminded her of something important she had forgotten. She lived in a constant state of alert, 24 hours a day. Her nerves were as tense as guitar strings, about to snap with the next false note. Margaret headed to the bathroom and looked at herself in the cracked mirror she had promised to change for 10 years. Her reflection returned the image of a woman broken into small pieces, but in her eyes, there was something new she didn't remember seeing before. A tiny spark, barely perceptible, like a candle lighting up in the deepest darkness. It was as if something inside her had awakened after years of forced hibernation. Outside, Betty watered her plants for the second time that morning. Her eyes didn't miss a detail. The kitchen clock marked 2 inches the afternoon when Frank returned, dragging his feet like a wounded animal. Margaret heard him arrive from the backyard, where she was hanging damp clothes under the relentless August sun of Texas, which turned every garment into a flag of surrender. His steps were heavier and more uncoordinated than normal. He had been drinking at his buddy Larry's house, as he did every time the world didn't behave according to his expectations. She folded the last white sheet with precise and ritual movements. Every perfect fold was an invisible shield against what was approaching, like a storm announced by the wind. Frank had left angry that morning, and problems never evaporated alone in their 5-decade marriage. They only grew and multiplied like malignant tumors fed by resentment and cheap beer. Old woman. His voice tore through the house like a cannon shot fired against the walls of his home-turned battlefield. Margaret walked inside carrying the worn wicker basket. Her bare feet moved in absolute silence over the linoleum floor he had installed himself when he still pretended to be a good husband. Frank was in the kitchen, opening and slamming cabinets with unnecessary violence, as if the furniture were guilty of his frustrations. He was looking for something to eat, but his manner of doing so seemed like a declaration of war against the plates, the pots, and everything that stood in his way. "Where is the food?" he grunted without looking at her, as if she were part of the furniture he could ignore until he needed it. Margaret put the basket on the floor by the door and headed to the stove with the resignation of someone who has accepted her role in a play she never wanted to star in. She had prepared chicken stew with fresh vegetables, his favorite dish when he was in a good mood, but good moods no longer existed in that house that was once her home. Only different degrees of tension, like stations of a personal hell where it was always winter. She served the steaming stew in a chipped blue ceramic bowl, the same one she had bought at the downtown market 20 years ago, when she still believed things could improve with love and patience. Her hands moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has served thousands of meals under the critical gaze of a relentless judge who was never satisfied with anything. Frank sat heavily in his wooden chair. The furniture creaked under his weight, as if protesting for having to support so much concentrated bitterness. Margaret placed the bowl in front of him carefully, not to make noise, and stepped back exactly 2 steps, maintaining the safety distance she had learned to calculate with mathematical precision after decades of dangerous cohabitation. The first sip was in sepulchral silence, then the second, accompanied by a grunt that could mean approval or disgust. With Frank, you never knew. Margaret waited, standing by the sink, with her hands crossed over her apron stained with grease and dried tears. Her eyes avoided looking at him directly, but she could feel every movement, every gesture, every change in his breathing, as if she were connected to him by invisible cables of fear. The bowl slipped from Frank's trembling hands. The crash of the ceramic against the cement floor resonated like an explosion in a library. The golden broth spilled, forming an irregular puddle dotted with vegetables that looked like small corpses floating in a sea of guilt. Pieces of carrot, celery, and chicken scattered like macabre confetti in a celebration no one had asked for. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream that had come out of that kitchen in 52 years of stormy marriage. Frank stood up slowly like a volcano preparing to erupt. His gaze darkened into a void of pure, accumulated malice. Margaret instinctively backed up until her back touched the metal sink. There was no more room to flee. It was the end of the road, the corner where she always ended up cornered. "Look what you did," he murmured, with that dangerously calm voice she knew better than the prayers she had learned as a child. It was the calm that precedes the most destructive hurricanes. Margaret knew that tone better than her own voice. It meant that the time for words had ended and the moment for fists arrived. There was no turning back now, nor apologies that could stop the inevitable. Harper chose that exact moment to arrive from work, as if fate had timed her appearance for the most dramatic moment. She entered through the back door with a tired smile that froze on her lips upon seeing the scene awaiting her. The stew spilled like blood on the floor, her father standing like a tower of contained fury, her mother cornered against the sink like a trapped animal. "Dad," she tried to intervene with a voice that broke before completing the word. "Shut up," roared Frank without turning to look at her, as if his own daughter were an annoying fly. The fist arrived without warning, fast and accurate like lightning, a right hook that connected with Margaret's left cheek with the precision of someone who has practiced that movement for years. The sound was dry and definitive, like a branch breaking under the weight of too much accumulated snow. In that split second, time didn't just stop. It unraveled. Margaret didn't feel the pain immediately. Instead, she felt a familiar sensation of floating, hovering above the kitchen tiles, watching the old woman on the floor as if she were a stranger. This was her survival trick, honed over 5 decades. Detach the soul so the body can take the beating. She thought of the girl she used to be at 20, the one who loved to dance, who had dreams of being a nurse, and she wondered, with a heartbreaking calmness, if that girl had finally died today, along with her tooth. Margaret flew backward like a rag doll. Her head hit against the wall with a dull thud that echoed through the whole house. Then she fell onto the pieces of broken plate and the spilled stew. Her body collapsed without resistance, as if all the strings keeping her upright had been cut in a single slash. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth like rusty coins. Something hard and small danced between her loose teeth. She spit it onto the floor. It was a piece of a molar she had lost in the impact, then another white fragment and another one. Her teeth, the few she had left in good condition after years of beatings, now decorated the floor along with the vegetables from the spilled stew. Harper stood paralyzed in the back door frame, her eyes filled with tears that dared not fall, but her feet remained nailed to the ground as if they had taken root. Margaret looked at her daughter, her flesh and blood, and saw the ultimate tragedy of her marriage. She hadn't just lost her own happiness. She had taught her daughter that cowardice was a form of love. The realization pierced her heart more sharply than Frank's fist ever could. She was truly, utterly alone in this war. 52 years of fear and conditioning are not overcome with good intentions or filial love. Frank leaned over Margaret's fallen body. His hot breath smelled of cheap beer, rancid sweat, and hate fermented over decades of failed marriage. "That's how you learn not to answer me," he spat in her ear, as if it were a poisoned blessing. Margaret didn't move from the cold floor stained with food and blood. She lay motionless like a fallen statue, with blood dripping slowly from her broken mouth onto the linoleum she had cleaned thousands of times. But her eyes remained open, staring fixedly at the cracked ceiling. As she tasted the metallic tang of her own blood, something shifted in the tectonic plates of her soul. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was a sudden, terrifying clarity. She realized that Frank wasn't going to stop until she was dead. And for the first time in 52 years, the fear of dying without ever having really lived outweighed the fear of his fists. The silence that had been her prison for half a century suddenly felt too loud to bear. In that moment, the victim died, and a survivor was born on the cold kitchen linoleum. It is often in our darkest moments that we find a strength we never knew existed. Margaret has finally reached her breaking point, but the way she decides to rise from this floor is going to change everything. You won't believe the plan she is about to set in motion. Margaret picked herself up from the floor with the slowness of someone who has learned to get up after every fall during 52 years of forced practice. Her movements were calculated and dignified, like those of a queen refusing to show weakness before her subjects. Blood dripped from her broken lip onto the faded apron, forming perfect circles like withered rose petals on fabric worn by time and tears. Harper remained motionless in the back door frame turned into a salt statue by the shock. Her eyes darted nervously between her bloody mother and her father, who had sat back down in his chair as if he had just completed one more household chore. The normality after the violence was the most disturbing aspect of that house. Everything returned to its geometric place, except the broken pieces of human dignity scattered on the floor like crystals from a destroyed window. "Mom," Harper murmured with a thread of a voice, but the words froze in her throat before forming a complete sentence that could express the horror of what she had just witnessed. Margaret didn't answer her daughter. She headed to the sink with firm steps and took a blue plaid kitchen towel. She soaked it with cold tap water and pressed it against her shattered mouth. The cotton turned red immediately, like a war flag that had just been baptized in battle. More blood dripped onto her worn shoes, the same ones she had bought at the market 5 years ago, when she still believed she could walk toward a different future. Frank turned on the television with the remote, as if the family drama were simply a minor interruption in his usual midday programming. The artificial sound of the news filled the uncomfortable silence that had remained suspended in the air like toxic smoke. A young woman with a perfect smile spoke about the sunny weather for the upcoming weekend. The contrast between her professional joy and the domestic tragedy was so obscene it seemed like a cruel joke of fate. Margaret walked toward the back door with silent determination. Every step was deliberate and measured, as if she had been rehearsing this choreography for decades without knowing it. She didn't run desperately, didn't scream for help, didn't beg for forgiveness, as she had done so many times before. She simply moved with the quiet and terrible dignity of someone who has made a completely irreversible decision. "Where are you going?" grunted Frank without taking his eyes off the screen, where a weatherman pointed at colorful maps with a smile that had never known fear. She didn't answer. For the first time in 52 years of submissive marriage, she deliberately ignored a direct question from her husband. The transgression was so radical and unprecedented that even Harper raised her head in surprise, as if she had heard her mother speak in a foreign language she didn't know. The harsh afternoon sun hit Margaret's swollen face. When she stepped out into the backyard, the light blinded her momentarily, creating spots of colors behind her closed eyelids. But she kept walking with a fixed course toward the wooden fence that separated her house from Walter's, the neighbor next door, who had been a silent witness to so many nightly screams. Walter was watering his red tomatoes when he saw her approaching like a bloody apparition. He was a 70-year-old widower, lonely for 5 years, who knew perfectly the characteristic sound of the screams coming from the Miller house every morning, like an alarm clock from hell. Seeing her, with her face destroyed and her clothes stained with blood, he dropped the green hose onto the damp earth. "Good Lord, what happened to you, Margaret?" he asked with genuine concern, although deep in his heart he already knew the horrible answer. "I need to go to the hospital," she said with a supernatural calm that contrasted dramatically with her appearance of a woman defeated in battle. Walter asked no more unnecessary questions. He had lived enough decades to recognize certain universal truths, without the need for detailed explanations that would only serve to humiliate the victim more. He ran toward his faded blue pickup truck, the same one he used to sell fresh vegetables at the Saturday market and which would now become an improvised ambulance. Margaret got into the passenger seat with careful and precise movements. Every breath produced sharp pain in her ribs that protested with every inhalation like out-of-tune musical instruments. Walter started the engine without saying a word. The silence between them was respectful and complicit, not uncomfortable or forced. During the 15-minute drive to St. Joseph's General Hospital, Margaret kept the kitchen towel pressed firmly against her broken mouth. The blood had soaked the cloth completely, but she didn't ask for a spare rag. Her eyes stared straight ahead through the dirty windshield, as if seeing something invisible that Walter couldn't perceive with his normal senses. At the main traffic light on Main Street, a young family crossed the street holding hands. The father carried a small girl with curly hair on his strong shoulders. The girl laughed with crystalline laughter while gently pulling her dad's hair. The mother walked beside them, smiling with genuine love, holding her husband's free hand. It was the perfect image of what a normal family should be in a world that worked correctly. Margaret watched them until they disappeared among the crowd of pedestrians, continuing with their ordinary lives. She didn't feel bitter envy. She didn't feel paralyzing sadness. Just a strange sensation of mental clarity, as if she had been seeing her entire life through glass fogged by tears, and someone had just cleaned it with expert hands. The General Hospital appeared in front of them like a white fortress of hope. Walter parked carefully in the emergency zone marked with yellow lines. He ran around the vehicle to help her down, but Margaret declined his extended arm with a gentle but absolutely firm gesture. She could walk alone toward her future. At the automatic emergency doors, a young doctor with an immaculate white coat received them. His professional eyes narrowed immediately upon evaluating Margaret's physical state with the experience of someone who has seen too many human tragedies. She wasn't his first patient arriving with that specific type of wounds that tell stories without the need for words. There was something unmistakable in the way battered women held their destroyed heads, a complex mixture of ancestral shame and newborn determination that he had learned to recognize during his residency years at the public hospital. The doctor frowned while mentally examining the evident wounds. Lips swollen like deflated balloons, teeth broken like stones in a dry river, the perfect fist-shaped bruise extending from the cheek to the temple like a macabre work of art. His years of medical experience told him with absolute certainty that this wasn't the result of a casual domestic accident. It was domestic violence in its purest and most criminal form. It was the precise moment when everything would change forever in Margaret's life. The white and relentless light illuminated her swollen face as if it were a map of pain. The young dentist, barely 30 years old, had seen many accidents in his 5 years of experience, but this was different. His expert hands examined Margaret's destroyed mouth with professional care. 2 molars, completely broken. The upper lip split in 2 places, the bleeding gum where a tooth used to be that now decorated her kitchen floor. The doctor frowned while taking notes in silence. "When did this happen?" he asked, without looking up from his file. "This afternoon," murmured Margaret. Her voice sounded strange with her swollen mouth, as if she were speaking from underwater. Dr. Anderson continued his exam. His trained fingers detected something more than recent wounds. There were old scars on the gums, old fractures in the jaw that had healed poorly. His small flashlight revealed secrets that Margaret had kept for decades. "Did you fall down the stairs?" The question arrived loaded with suspicion. Margaret nodded automatically. It was the answer she had rehearsed during the trip in Walter's truck. But her eyes didn't sustain the lie. They drifted toward the window, where the green curtains filtered the evening light. The doctor straightened up slowly, walked to the sink, and took off his latex gloves with deliberate movements. In the office mirror, his eyes met Margaret's. It was a silent moment, but loaded with meaning. "Nurse Jessica," he called toward the door. "Can you come in for a moment?" A woman of 40 years entered the office. She wore her hair pulled back in a high ponytail, and her eyes had the wisdom of someone who has seen too much human suffering. She was the head nurse of the emergency shift, known for her ability to detect special cases. Dr. Anderson approached her and whispered something in her ear. Nurse Jessica's eyes went immediately toward Margaret. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of professional recognition. She had seen those wounds before, on other women, in other offices. "Is this frequent?" asked the doctor in a low voice, but loud enough for Margaret to hear. The question floated in the air like smoke. Margaret felt something move in her chest. It wasn't fear. It was something similar to hope, but more dangerous. It was the first symptom that someone had noticed the truth she had hidden for so long. Nurse Jessica approached the stretcher where Margaret waited. Her movements were soft, but decided. She sat in the swivel chair and rolled until she was in front of the old woman. Her eyes met hers directly without evasions. "Ma'am, I have to ask you something important," she said with a firm but gentle voice. "Did someone hurt you?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 10 seconds. Margaret counted them mentally, as she had counted thousands of similar silences during her marriage. But this time was different. This time someone had asked the right question. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't control. They weren't tears of physical pain. They were tears of primitive relief, as if a dam had begun to crack after holding back a river for decades. "My husband," she finally whispered. The words came out broken, but clear. Nurse Jessica nodded without surprise. She had expected that answer from the moment she saw the wounds. She took Margaret's wrinkled hand between hers. Her fingers were warm and firm, like an anchor in the middle of a storm. "Has this happened before?" she asked with professional care. Margaret nodded slowly. More than half a century of violence couldn't be summarized in words, but her gesture was enough. Nurse Jessica exchanged a significant look with Dr. Anderson. Both knew the protocol for these cases. "Mrs. Margaret," said the nurse while opening a drawer in her desk, "I know someone who can help you, but I need you to tell me if you really want help." The question was direct and unadorned. There was no room for half-truths or excuses. It was the moment to decide if she wanted to continue being a victim or become something different, something more dangerous for men like Frank. Margaret looked at her hands stained with dried blood, then looked toward the window where the sun was beginning to set. Somewhere in the city, Frank was sitting in his chair watching television, probably believing that everything had returned to normal after his explosion of violence. "Yes," she said with a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "I want help." That simple yes was perhaps the bravest word Margaret has uttered in 52 years. Admitting the truth is the first step toward freedom, but as she teams up with a relentless lawyer, Frank has no idea that his reign of terror is on a countdown. Nurse Jessica smiled for the first time since she had entered the office. It was a small smile, but full of dangerous promises. An hour later, the office door opened to reveal a woman who seemed to have walked out of a lawyer movie. Sarah Jenkins was 45 years old, with short brown-dyed hair and wearing a navy blue suit that screamed professional competence. Her low-heeled shoes clicked against the linoleum floor like decisive hammer blows. In her hands, she carried a black leather briefcase and a notebook that had already seen too many similar stories. She was the lawyer Nurse Jessica had called, a specialist in domestic violence cases and known in the courts for her relentless tenacity. "Mrs. Margaret," she said as she closed the door behind her. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. Nurse Jessica told me your situation." There were no long introductions or speeches of courtesy. Sarah sat in the doctor's chair and opened her notebook with precise movements. Her eyes evaluated Margaret's wounds with the professional coldness of someone who has documented hundreds of similar cases. "I need you to tell me everything," she said, while taking a gold pen out of her briefcase. "From the beginning. From the first time he hit you." Margaret felt the words getting stuck in her throat like stones. 52 years of silence aren't broken easily. She had kept every blow, every humiliation, every threat in the locked chest of her memory. Opening it meant reliving every moment of pain. "I don't know where to start," she murmured. "Start with today," suggested Sarah with a firm but not cruel voice. "What happened this afternoon?" The words began to come out slowly, like water dripping from a broken faucet. Margaret recounted the fallen plate, Frank's explosion, the punch that broke her teeth. Sarah wrote down every detail without showing emotion, as if she were taking an order at a restaurant. "Harper saw what happened?" she asked without looking up from her notes. "Yes, but she can't." Margaret didn't finish the sentence. She couldn't admit that her own daughter had abandoned her in the most important moment. Sarah raised her eyes for the first time. It was a look that had seen too many mothers protecting children who didn't protect them. "How often does he hit you?" The question fell like a bomb in the silence of the office. Margaret closed her eyes and saw a mental calendar full of days marked with fists and tears. Sundays after football games, Fridays when he arrived drunk from work, Wednesdays when the food wasn't ready on time. "A lot," she whispered. It was the most honest word she had said in years. Sarah wrote something else in her notebook. Then she closed the pen with a definitive click that sounded like a sentence. She leaned forward and looked directly into Margaret's swollen eyes. "Ma'am, I'm going to be very clear with you," she said, with a voice that allowed no argument. "You can keep living like this until he kills you, or you can fight." The word fight resonated in the office like a war cry. Margaret had never thought of her situation in terms of a battle. For her, it had simply been survival. But Sarah was talking about something different, something more active and dangerous. "Fight how?" she asked with a voice so small she barely heard it. Sarah opened her briefcase and took out a manila folder full of papers. She spread them on the table like a general showing battle maps. There were legal forms, phone numbers, shelter addresses, and a list of rights Margaret didn't know she had. "Report him, document everything. Ask for immediate protective measures," she explained while pointing to each document. "I have contacts in the district attorney's office. I know judges who take these cases seriously, but I need you to be completely sure." Margaret looked at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. For 52 years, she had believed her situation was normal, that all wives lived with fear. The idea that there was a legal system designed to protect her was completely new. "What if he gets angrier?" she asked. It was the question she had avoided asking for decades. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a gentle smile. It was the smile of someone who had sent many Franks to jail. "Mrs. Margaret, he's already angry. He's been angry for 52 years. The difference is that now you can do something about it." The lawyer fell silent for a moment, letting the words settle. Then she leaned forward and took Margaret's free hand, the one without bandages. "If you want justice, we have to start now." she said, with an intensity that made the air in the office feel electric. "I have contacts and evidence that can save you, but you have to decide today before he suspects something has changed." The wall clock marked 5:30. Somewhere in the city, Frank was probably wondering where his dinner was. He had no idea his world was about to collapse completely. Sarah spread the papers on the metal office table, as if they were cards in a deadly game. Every document had a specific purpose. Complaint forms, restraining order requests, authorizations to take photographs of the wounds. It was a legal arsenal Margaret had never imagined existed. "First, we need to document everything," explained Sarah while pointing to a digital camera she had taken out of her briefcase. "Every bruise, every wound, every mark he has left on you. Photos are evidence that doesn't lie." Margaret instinctively touched her swollen lip. The idea of someone photographing her pain made her feel exposed and vulnerable. But there was also something liberating in that vulnerability. It was as if she could finally show the truth she had hidden under long sleeves and makeup for decades. "Will other people see them?" she asked, with a voice broken on the inside. "Only the judge and the prosecutor," responded Sarah with professional firmness, "and possibly the jury, if we go to trial. But those photos can be the difference between him going free or going to jail." The word jail floated in the air like a strange bird. Margaret had never imagined Frank behind bars. In her darkest nightmares, he had always been an unstoppable force, like a hurricane that simply had to be endured until it passed. Sarah began taking photographs with the efficiency of a forensic technician. Every image captured a piece of the story. The split lip, the broken teeth, the fist-shaped bruise extending from cheek to ear. The camera flash illuminated decades of silent violence. "Now we need testimonies," she continued, while putting the camera away. "Are there neighbors who have seen or heard anything?" The wrinkled face of Betty appeared immediately in Margaret's mind, the curious neighbor who always watered her plants when the screaming started. The other inhabitants of the neighborhood who turned down the volume on their TVs when Frank lost control. "Betty," she murmured. "She sees everything from her window. She would be willing to testify." Margaret nodded slowly. Betty had been a silent witness for years. Maybe it was time for her silence to turn into words that could save her. Sarah wrote the name in her notebook. Anyone else? Family? Friends? The question revealed the sad reality of Margaret's life. 52 years of isolation had reduced her world to 3 people: Frank, Harper, and herself. Frank had built a prison so perfect she had lost contact with the outside world. "I don't have many friends," she admitted with shame. "Don't worry," said Sarah without judgment in her voice. "The neighbors are enough. We also need today's medical certificates, and if you have text messages or calls where he threatens you, that would be perfect." Margaret thought of her old phone kept in her apron pocket. Frank sent her messages when he was drunk, words full of hate she deleted immediately so as not to have to see them. Now she realized she had been destroying evidence that could have saved her. I always delete the messages," she confessed. "You delete them all?" Sarah asked, her pen hovering over the paper. "Wait," Margaret hesitated. "There was one I saved. And sometimes he leaves voicemails when I don't answer quickly enough. I never listen to them because I'm afraid, but they are still on the phone." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "You have voicemails? Audio recordings of him threatening you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, and a message from last week. That is crucial," Sarah said, marking it down with intensity. "Written threats are bad, but a judge hearing his voice, that changes everything." It was so cruel she had closed the phone without deleting it, as if she couldn't believe her own husband had written those words. She took out the phone with trembling hands. Her fingers navigated clumsily through the messages until finding the one she was looking for. The words appeared on the small screen like poisonous snakes. "Useless old woman. When I get back, I'm going to teach you what happens when you don't obey." Sarah read the message with eagle eyes. A small and dangerous smile appeared on her lips. "With this, it's enough," she murmured, while taking photographs of the phone. "A direct threat message. This is pure gold in court." Margaret looked at her reflection in the black screen of the phone when Sarah finished photographing. Her swollen face looked back at her, but there was something different in her eyes. It was no longer just pain. It was determination mixed with fear, as if she were looking at a stranger who had lived inside her for years. "Are you sure you want to do this?" asked Sarah while organizing the documents. Because once we start, there is no turning back. He will know you spoke, and he will get furious. The question hung in the air like a sword. Margaret closed her eyes and saw two paths in front of her. One led back to her kitchen, to serve coffee in silence, to count the days until the next blow killed her. The other led toward the unknown, toward a territory where she would have to be brave in ways she had never imagined. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Sarah. "Let's do it," she said with a voice she hadn't used in 52 years. Watching Margaret shift from a terrified victim into a woman gathering ammunition for a legal war is incredibly satisfying. She is arming herself with the truth. But the real question is, how will a man like Frank react when he realizes he's being hunted by the very person he underestimated? It was the voice of a woman who had decided to stop being a victim. The next day, Sarah parked in front of Betty's house in a silver car that shone like a promise of justice. Margaret followed her up the cracked concrete path, feeling that every step took her further away from the silent world where she had lived for decades. Betty opened the door before they knocked. At 78, her eyes were still sharp like a hawk's. She had seen the car arrive from her living room window, the same window from where she had been a witness to 52 years of domestic violence. "Good morning, Mrs. Margaret," she said with a voice containing decades of unexpressed worry. "Who is your friend?" Sarah introduced herself with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. In minutes, the three women were sitting in Betty's living room, surrounded by family photographs and the sweet smell of cinnamon that always floated in that house. "I need to ask you about what you have seen and heard at the Miller house," said Sarah directly. Without polite preambles, Betty exchanged a look with Margaret. It was a conversation they had avoided for years, as if talking about the violence made it more real. Now, finally, someone was asking for the truth. "I've seen a lot," admitted Betty with a grave voice. "Too much." Her words opened a floodgate that had been closed for decades. Betty recounted the nightly screams that woke up the whole neighborhood, the times she had seen Margaret go out to the yard with a swollen face, the slamming doors that made windows shake, the tears she had witnessed from her kitchen. "Would you be willing to testify in court?" asked Sarah while taking notes. Betty didn't hesitate. "Yes. It was about time someone did something." They left Betty's house with a signed statement and headed to Walter's house. The man who had taken Margaret to the hospital received them in his yard among tomato plants growing in recycled cans. His hands were dirty with soil, but his eyes were clear and determined. "That man is a demon," he said bluntly. When Sarah explained the situation, "I have heard the screams for years. Last Tuesday night was so loud my grandson woke up crying." Walter described specific threats he had heard through the thin walls, blood-curdling words pronounced by Frank in his darkest moments. Sarah wrote every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. "Would you also testify?" she asked. "Of course," replied Walter. "Margaret is a good woman. She doesn't deserve to live like that." The third stop was at the house of Nancy, a 75-year-old lady who lived 2 houses down. Nancy had been Margaret's friend before Frank began to isolate her from the world. She had witnessed the gradual change, how Margaret stopped going out, stopped smiling, stopped being herself. "Frank changed her," said Nancy with sadness while serving her fresh water. "Before she was so cheerful. She sang while hanging clothes. After the first years of marriage, I never heard her sing again." Her words painted the portrait of a woman who had been erased slowly, like a drawing exposed too long to the sun. Sarah documented every testimony, building a solid case like a brick wall. When they returned to the car, Sarah took out her phone and put it in recording mode. On the screen appeared the messages she had downloaded from Margaret's phone the night before. It wasn't just the threatening message they had found. With the help of a computer technician, they had recovered deleted messages from the last 6 months. "Are you ready to hear this?" asked Sarah. Margaret nodded, although her hands shook when Sarah pressed the play button. Frank's voice came out of the small speaker like liquid poison. "Stupid old woman. When I get home, you're going to see what happens to you for disobeying me. If you keep crying, I'm going to give you a real reason to cry. You're useless. No one else would put up with you like I do." Every message was worse than the last. They were the words of a man who had turned psychological terror into a refined art. Sarah stopped the recording and looked at Margaret with eyes full of professional fury. "With this, he won't save himself," she said, with a voice that sounded like a death sentence. Margaret looked out the window toward her house, where Frank was probably watching television, without imagining that his world was about to collapse. For the first time in 52 years, she had the power. It was a feeling so strange, she almost didn't recognize it. It was the power of truth backed by the law, and it was terribly beautiful. That feeling of empowerment is the turning point we have all been waiting for. Frank is sitting inside, completely oblivious that his own cruel words have just become the weapon that will destroy him. But outside, the silence is breaking in a way he never expected. Rumors began to spread like a trail of dry gunpowder during the summer. Betty had been the first to speak, but not the only one. In less than 3 days, every house on the block knew that Margaret had sought legal help against her husband. It was the biggest scandal that had shaken those dusty streets in decades. Curious looks followed them down the street, like sticky shadows that lengthened with every step she took. Some neighbors greeted them with nervous smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Others looked away when they saw her approaching, as if domestic violence were contagious and could infect their own apparently quiet marriages. There were those who whispered behind their lace curtains, creating theories about what really happened at the Miller house. "They say she's going to sue Frank," murmured Mrs. Perez, while hanging her wet clothes on the clothesline separating her yard from the neighbors. Her voice cut through the morning air until reaching Harper's ears, who was returning from work with a worried expression engraved on her face like a recent scar. Margaret's daughter had noticed the subtle but significant changes in the family routine she had known all her life. Her mother no longer served coffee with the same silent submission that had characterized her mornings for 5 decades. Now there was something different in her movements, a new firmness that made her nervous and confused. It was as if a stranger had occupied the body of the woman she had known since childhood, leaving only familiar traces of the mother she remembered. Margaret's eyes no longer automatically diverted when Frank entered a room. Her hands didn't tremble when he raised his voice. Even her way of walking had changed, as if she had remembered she had a right to occupy space in the world. That Thursday afternoon, Harper found Margaret sitting in the kitchen organizing papers she had never seen before in that house. The documents were arranged in careful piles on the yellow laminate table, which had witnessed so many silent humiliations. There were photographs placed face down that Harper didn't dare turn over, as if they contained truths too painful to face. Among the papers, Harper managed to see official forms with government seals, case numbers written in blue ink, and signatures she didn't recognize. It was like discovering her mother had a secret life, a parallel world from which she had been completely excluded. "Mom," she said with a voice broken on the inside, feeling the words stuck in her throat like stones. "The neighbors are talking." Margaret raised her eyes from the papers with a calm Harper had never seen on her mother's wrinkled face. Her hands didn't tremble when she closed the manila folder Sarah had given her 2 days earlier. It was a small gesture, but loaded with monumental meaning. For the first time in decades, she had secrets she didn't share with her family, decisions she had taken without asking anyone for permission. "What are they saying?" she asked with a tranquility that contrasted dramatically with the emotional chaos Harper felt growing in her chest. "They say you want to destroy the family." The words came out stumbled, as if Harper were confessing an unforgivable crime. The words fell between them like stones thrown into a lake that had been calm for too long. Margaret remained silent for a moment that felt eternal, considering her answer while her eyes turned toward the window where Betty watered her red geraniums for the 3rd time that day, clearly waiting to catch some fragment of conversation. The silence extended until it became uncomfortable. Harper could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the old refrigerator, the distant sound of children playing in the street. They were the normal sounds of any afternoon, but everything felt different now, loaded with tensions that didn't exist a week earlier. "No, my daughter," said Margaret finally, with a voice Harper didn't completely recognize. "I just want to save myself." The brutal honesty of those 6 words left Harper completely without an answer. For 50 years, she had lived with the carefully constructed fantasy that her family was normal, that nightly screams were simply ordinary marriage arguments, that her mother's occasional bruises were explicable domestic accidents. Now her mother was destroying that fantasy with the simplest and most devastating truth in the world. "And Dad?" asked Harper with a voice so small she barely heard it above the noise of the air conditioner. "Your dad is going to have to face the consequences of what he has done," replied Margaret, while organizing the documents in chronological order with precise movements for the first time in 52 years. At that exact moment, as if summoned by the conversation, Frank entered through the back door. His work boots sounded on the worn linoleum like war drums, announcing the arrival of an army. He had been drinking beer at his buddy Larry's house all afternoon, but his gaze was alert and dangerous. Neighborhood rumors had also reached his ears through the men gathering at the corner store. His presence immediately filled the kitchen with that familiar tension Harper had learned to recognize since she was a child. It was as if the air itself became thicker and harder to breathe when he entered a room. "What are you talking about?" he grunted while dropping heavily into his usual chair, the same one he had occupied for decades, as if it were a throne from where he ruled his small kingdom of terror. Margaret put the papers away in the folder with deliberate and controlled movements. There was no haste in her gestures, but neither was there the fear Harper had seen all her life. It was as if her mother had found a center of gravity she didn't know existed, an inner force keeping her stable even in the threatening presence of her husband. "Nothing important," lied Harper quickly, her family survival instincts activating automatically to protect the precarious peace of the home. Frank studied them with narrowed eyes moving between mother and daughter, like those of a predator evaluating its prey. His years of experience controlling his family told him something fundamental had changed in the home dynamic. The air in the kitchen felt different, loaded with dangerous electricity he didn't know how to interpret. The evening light entered through the window, creating long shadows stretching across the floor like accusing fingers. In that golden light, the traces of the last blow were still visible on Margaret's face, the lip barely beginning to unswell, the bruise fading slowly around her left eye. "Margaret," he said with that threatening voice he had perfected over decades of marriage, "look at me when I talk to you." She raised her eyes slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. But instead of the usual submission that had characterized her interactions for 52 years, Frank encountered a look he hadn't seen before. It was the look of someone who no longer had anything to lose, someone who had crossed an invisible line and had no intention of returning. The doorbell interrupted the tense moment like a fire alarm. It was a sharp and official sound that cut the charged air of the kitchen like an emergency siren. No one moved for a few seconds that felt like hours. In that house, unannounced visits always brought trouble, and the bell rang with an authority none of them recognized. Harper went to open the door with hesitant steps, her legs trembling slightly. On the threshold was a young man dressed in a cheap gray suit, carrying a black leather folder and a professional expression that admitted no discussion or delay. His eyes were cold, but not cruel, like someone who had delivered bad news so many times he had become immune to emotional reactions. "Mr. Frank Miller?" he asked, with a clear and official voice, consulting a document in his folder. "Yes," replied Frank from the kitchen, without getting up from his chair, but with a new tension in his voice Harper hadn't heard before. The man entered the house without waiting for an invitation and extended a thick manila envelope toward Frank. It was official and threatening, sealed with the county court seal. The black letters on the front spelled out Frank's full name like an anticipated sentence, and underneath were case numbers turning his life into a legal file. "You are summoned to appear before the court," said the judicial officer, with the professional monotony of someone who had delivered thousands of similar summons during his career. "The date and time are specified in the document. Your presence is mandatory." Frank took the envelope with hands trembling slightly for the first time in decades. The paper felt heavy between his fingers, as if containing more than simple words. His eyes went immediately toward Margaret, who remained sitting at the kitchen table like a statue of newfound dignity, observing the scene with a calm he didn't know how to interpret. The officer withdrew after briefly explaining the legal procedure, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any scream that had resonated in that house. The door closed with a definitive sound that seemed to seal the fate of everyone present. The manila envelope remained on the table like a time bomb waiting to explode, changing forever the emotional geography of that family. "What did you do?" roared Frank, getting up from his chair with violence that made the plates in the drainer shake. Margaret didn't move an inch, didn't back up as she had done for 5 decades of submissive marriage. She didn't shrink, waiting for the blow that would inevitably come. She simply looked at him with those new eyes he didn't know how to interpret, eyes that had seen too much and no longer had the capacity for fear. "What I should have done decades ago," she replied with a voice so firm it echoed through the whole house and was probably heard even in Betty's yard. For the first time in over 50 years, Frank Miller was left completely speechless. looking at a woman he no longer recognized as the wife he had controlled for so long. The silence in that kitchen speaks louder than decades of shouting ever could. The power dynamic has officially shifted, but the battle isn't over yet. Wait until you hear what happens when Frank has to face his crimes in a public courtroom. The courtroom was cold like a morgue and smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with the fear emanating from those waiting for justice or fearing facing it. The gray walls were decorated only with official portraits of officials looking from their gold frames with severe expressions. Margaret sat in the first row of wooden benches, dressed in her best white cotton blouse and a navy blue skirt she had ironed 3 times that morning until every pleat was perfect. In her trembling but determined hands, she held a manila folder containing a lifetime of silent evidence, photographs documenting decades of violence, medical certificates telling stories of broken bones and broken spirits, testimonies of neighbors who had been mute witnesses for too long. It was the complete file of a life lived in the shadows, now exposed to the relentless light of justice. Sarah was sitting next to her reviewing documents with the mechanical efficiency of a general, preparing for the final battle of a long and brutal war. Her black, low-heeled shoes had clicked on the court marble like hammers of justice when they entered together through the main door, passing local reporters drawn by the case that had begun to generate conversation in the community. The lawyer wore a dark gray suit screaming professional competence, and her movements were precise, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. In her black leather briefcase, she kept copies of every document, every photograph, every recording they had compiled during weeks of meticulous investigation. "Are you ready?" asked Sarah without looking up from her notes, while reviewing for the last time the sequence of evidence she would present. Margaret nodded slowly, although her stomach contracted like a closed fist, and her heart beat so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She had rehearsed her testimony for whole days, practicing in front of the bathroom mirror words she had never pronounced out loud. But now that the moment had arrived, the carefully prepared phrases seemed to have fled her memory, like birds frightened by a sudden noise. The back door opened with a metallic squeak echoing through the room like the groan of a rusty hinge. Frank walked in with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his acts, as if arriving at a routine work meeting instead of facing decades of criminal accusations. He wore his only stain-free shirt, ironed by Harper that morning, and pants smelling of mothballs because he had to take them from the back of the closet where he kept clothes for special occasions. His lawyer, a thin man of about 50, with glasses constantly sliding down his sweaty nose, followed him, dragging a briefcase that seemed too big for the limited defense he could offer. It was evident the case had taken him by surprise, and he hadn't had enough time to prepare a solid strategy against the mountain of evidence Sarah had compiled. Frank's eyes met Margaret's for the first time since the night of the summons, when he had arrived home drunk and shouting threats that no longer had the power to terrorize her. In that look, there was genuine surprise mixed with disbelief, as if he couldn't believe his submissive wife was actually there, dressed with dignity and ready to speak against him in front of strangers. It was as if he were looking at a stranger who had usurped the body of the woman he had controlled for 5 decades. The Margaret he knew would never have been capable of something like this. That woman shrank when he raised his voice. She trembled when he raised a hand. She apologized even when she was the victim of his violence. "Are you really going to do this?" he murmured, loud enough for her to hear above the murmur of conversations filling the room as more spectators arrived. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She had learned over the last weeks that silence could be more powerful than 1,000 words when used at the right moment. Her eyes held his gaze without blinking, without looking away, without showing the submission that had been her automatic response for so long. The room gradually filled with other people. Neighborhood neighbors who had come to show their support, social workers following similar cases, law students observing the legal process as part of their education. The murmur of conversations created background noise, feeling like the ocean before a storm. Judge Benjamin Sullivan entered through a side door located behind the bench, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire room. He was a 60-year-old man with perfectly combed gray hair and eyes that had seen too many human tragedies during his 30 years in the judicial system. His black robe extended behind him like the wings of an avenging angel, and every step he took resonated with absolute authority. The silence following his entrance was so complete, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was a silence loaded with expectation and tension, like the moment before the first lightning strikes in a thunderstorm. "Good morning," he said with a grave and clear voice while settling into his high chair, adjusting his glasses to review the documents in front of him. "We are here to review the domestic violence case presented by Mrs. Margaret Miller against Mr. Frank Miller." The words domestic violence resonated in the room like funeral bells, making official and public what had been private and secret for decades. Frank straightened in his chair, his initial confidence beginning to crack like old paint exposed too long to the sun. For the first time, he was beginning to understand this wasn't a formality he could handle with his usual manipulative charm. The judge reviewed the documents in front of him with the meticulousness of someone understanding that the words he pronounces in the next few minutes will change lives forever. His eyes moved between the papers and the faces of those waiting for his decision, evaluating not just legal facts, but also the emotional weight of over 5 decades of silent suffering. "Mrs. Miller," continued the judge, addressing Margaret directly, with a voice combining judicial authority with human compassion. "Are you ready to present your testimony before this court?" Margaret stood up with movements appearing in slow motion, feeling every muscle in her body trembling with a mixture of terror and determination. It was the moment she had feared and desired for weeks. Her legs felt like jelly, but her spirit felt more solid than ever. It was as if all the years of silence had been preparing her for this unique moment of absolute truth. With the dignity of a queen who had waited all her life to reclaim her usurped throne, she looked directly into the judge's eyes and answered with a voice surprising even herself with its clarity and firmness. "Yes, Your Honor, I am ready." That single sentence marks the definitive end of Margaret's silence and the beginning of Frank's nightmare. He still believes he can manipulate the room, but he has absolutely no idea that the device Sarah is reaching for is about to unmask the monster he truly is. The air in the courtroom had become dense, almost unbreathable, loaded with the expectation of everyone present. The cold light filtering through the high windows barely illuminated the tense faces, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Margaret, standing, maintained an upright posture, her gaze fixed on the judge, a stillness belying the storm of emotions she had endured for decades. Lawyer Sarah, with a firm and determined gesture, activated a small device on the table. A metallic sound, almost imperceptible at first, preceded Frank's distorted voice, which began to resonate in every corner of the room. His words, raw and full of anger, were like daggers thrown into the air, every syllable an echo of the violence Margaret had lived in silence. "Shut up, useless old woman," Frank's voice blared from the speakers, a voicemail he had left her weeks ago, loaded with such palpable contempt it made some present shrink in their seats. Then, Sarah played a second file of video Margaret had accidentally recorded in her pocket during the stew incident. The sound of a dry blow, followed by a stifled moan, filled the silent courtroom. The threats followed one after another, weaving a web of fear now exposed without mercy before the law. "I'm going to teach you to respect me. I swear you'll regret answering me back." The voice resonated with a frozen tone, cutting the breath. Every phrase was a hammer hitting the conscience of those listening, irrefutable testimony of the cruelty dominating Margaret's life. Frank, sitting at the defense table, shrank visibly. His face, which at the start of the trial showed arrogant confidence, turned pale, almost greenish, as if the color of life were escaping him. His eyes, small and nervous, moved aimlessly, from Margaret to the judge, then to the floor, as if trying to find a hole to hide from the truth cornering him. A thread of cold sweat began to slowly roll down his temple, marking a visible path on his wrinkled skin, a shiny trail of his growing desperation. It was the first time Margaret saw him so vulnerable, so disarmed, his facade of a strong and dominant man crumbling before the evidence. A strange sensation took over her, an invisible knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't satisfaction, but a pang of sadness for the lost years, for the life that never was, for the man he could have been and chose not to be. After the audio, Sarah projected a series of photographs on a large screen located to the side of the judge's bench. The images appeared one after another, each more shocking than the last. They were photographs of Margaret, her swollen and purple lip, left eye surrounded by a dark halo, the mark of a hand visible on her right arm, Frank's fingers engraved on her skin. Then the most shocking images, the ones causing a murmur of horror in the room. Her broken teeth, fragments of enamel, and blood staining her mouth. A raw, undeniable vision that took the breath away from some present and caused others to look away, unable to bear the raw reality. The judge observed every detail with a stony seriousness, unblinking, his face a mask of impartiality hiding the gravity of the situation. Frank looked away, unable to face the truth of his own actions. His head down, his figure shrunk, his hand, once firm and dominant, trembling slightly on the polished wood table, an unequivocal sign of his crumbling. The medical reports were presented next, stacked in a thick folder Sarah placed in front of the judge. Detailed diagnoses, precise dates, clinical descriptions of every injury, confirmation of recurrent wounds, a pattern of abuse extending over years, documented meticulously by health professionals. Every document was another brick in the wall of evidence, rising relentlessly against Frank, irrefutable testimony of his guilt. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine, a physical release of 50 years of held breath. For decades, Frank had made her believe she was crazy, that she provoked him, that she imagined the cruelty. But here, in this cold room, strangers were nodding at her pain. The truth was no longer a ghost haunting her kitchen. It was written in black and white, stamped by the state. It was the validation of her entire existence. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't useless. She was a human being who had been wronged, and for the first time, the world was listening. The folder she herself had carried, pressed against her chest throughout the hearing, seemed to vibrate with its own energy, an echo of her own resistance, of the silent strength keeping her standing. The silence following the presentation of all evidence was deafening, broken only by the slight hum of the ceiling ventilation and the occasional throat clearing of an attendee. Frank wiped the sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve, a clumsy, desperate gesture revealing his unease and total loss of composure. His haughtiness had vanished completely, replaced by an expression of panic and defeat. He looked like a trapped small man, his world crumbling around him with every piece of evidence presented. Margaret observed him without emotion. The rage, the resentment, were gone, replaced by a glacial calm, a peace she hadn't felt in decades, a liberation brewing deep within her being. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Frank for a moment, as if evaluating him for the last time, weighing each of his actions. Then his gaze settled on Margaret, a look containing a glimpse of respect and understanding, an almost imperceptible nod, a silent recognition of her bravery and the injustice she had suffered. He cleared his throat, a grave, definitive sound resonating in the room, announcing the end of the wait. The wooden gavel, symbol of law and justice, was about to fall, sealing Frank's fate. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, a strong and solitary throb in her chest, full of a mix of apprehension and hope. The moment of truth had arrived. The judge, with a firm and unwavering voice, announced he would give his decision immediately, without further delay, the end of an agony and the beginning of a new life. The judge straightened in his seat, his imposing figure dominating the room, a beacon of authority amidst the palpable tension. His voice, grave and resonant, projected with crystal clarity, and every word felt like a stone slab falling on the dense air of the court. After carefully reviewing all evidence presented and listening attentively to the testimonies, began the judge, his gaze traversing Frank and then Margaret. This court has reached a decision. Frank tensed visibly, eyes nailed to the judge's figure, breathing agitated and shallow, like a cornered animal. Margaret, for her part, maintained unbreakable composure, her breathing barely perceptible. A thread of hope, fragile but persistent, wove inside her, illuminating the darkness of her past years and promising a long-awaited dawn. The first part of the sentence was pronounced with clarity, leaving no room for doubt, a direct blow to the heart of Frank's tyranny. Mr. Frank Miller will be evicted from the family home within a period no greater than 48 hours. The word evicted resonated in the room, an echo of the loss of his power, of his control. Frank opened his mouth, trying to articulate a protest, a babble of disbelief, but the judge's severe gaze silenced him instantly, cutting the word in his throat. A low murmur spread from the back of the room, where some neighbors had congregated, faces expectant, whispering among themselves, exchanging looks of amazement and confirmation. Margaret felt a slight tremor in her hands, but not from fear, but from the imminence of a long-awaited change, a liberation materializing before her eyes, an invisible weight lifting from her shoulders. The house, symbol of her oppression, would stop being her prison. Furthermore, continued the judge, voice without inflection, every word another nail in the coffin of Frank's impunity, he is ordered to pay economic restitution for physical and moral damages caused to Mrs. Margaret, as well as covering the costs of her dental and medical treatments. Frank clenched his fists under the table, knuckles whitening from pressure, face reddened by contained anger and humiliation. Money for him had always been a symbol of power, of control over others, a tool to submit and dominate. Now that same power was slipping from his hands, used to repair the damage he himself had inflicted with such cruelty. A bitter irony eating him from inside. Margaret lowered her gaze, observing her own hands intertwined on her lap. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept. It had a tangible price, a real weight, a restitution going beyond material, touching dignity. The hardest part of the sentence arrived next, hitting Frank with the force of lightning, stripping him of any vestige of freedom. And a criminal process for aggravated physical violence will be initiated with a permanent restraining order prohibiting him from approaching Mrs. Margaret. It is rare to see karma delivered so swiftly and precisely, and seeing Frank shrink under the weight of his own actions is pure poetic justice. But with the legal victory secured, Margaret still has one final, difficult hurdle: physically removing the tyrant from her home. The words permanent restraining order floated in the air like an invisible, impassable barrier rising between them forever, guaranteeing Margaret's safety. Frank stood up abruptly, chair scraping the floor with a strident sound resonating in the room, a mute scream of desperation. "This is an injustice," yelled his voice hoarse and broken by desperation, figure trembling, eyes bulging, unable to accept the reality of his condemnation. Harper, sitting in the back row, face pale and lips pressed tight, lowered her head, hair covering her face like a veil of shame and regret. She hadn't intervened, hadn't spoken a single word during the whole trial. Her silence weighed more than any accusation. Shame wrapped her like a dark, suffocating mantle, asphyxiating her. Margaret saw her from the corner of her eye. There was no anger in her heart toward her daughter, only deep sadness for the distance created between them, for the pain Harper also carried, albeit differently. A barely audible sigh escaped Margaret's lips, a liberating breath marking the end of an era of fear. The judge struck the gavel with a dry and final sound, a resonant echo sealing Frank's fate. Silence in the court. Frank was escorted by an officer, his protest drowned by the unbreakable authority of the law. Steps heavy and dragged, figure shrunk. The room began to empty slowly, people leaving in a murmur of comments and amazement. Margaret remained standing, immobile, watching people leave, a strange sensation of lightness invading her. Outside, in the hallway, voices were heard, growing murmurs. Neighbors waiting, curious looks, whispers of amazement and confirmation. The news would spread like gunpowder through the whole neighborhood, revealing the truth of what happened. The hook of freedom, although still incipient, was already felt in the air, promising a new dawn for Margaret and the definitive fall of Frank. "Shut up forever, old woman." Frank's words resonated one last time in the house, which had been witness to over 5 decades of domestic terror. But now those words arrived empty, stripped of the power they once had. It was like hearing the roar of a lion that had lost all its teeth. The man who had controlled every aspect of that house for nearly 5 decades now walked through the hallways like a stranger. His heavy steps on the worn linoleum sounded different. They were no longer the steps of a tyrant in his kingdom. They were the steps of a defeated man having less than 24 hours to disappear forever. Frank had returned from court with the face of someone who had seen his own funeral. His hands trembled slightly while opening his bedroom closet. Inside hung the same wrinkled shirts he had used to intimidate his family for decades. Now they seemed like unimportant rags. He began stuffing his clothes into black plastic bags, the same ones Margaret used for trash. The symbolism was perfect. His whole life fit in trash bags. Every garment he folded was a reminder of his failure as a human being. Harper appeared in the bedroom door. Her eyes were red from crying, but not tears of sadness for her father. They were tears of shame for having been a silent accomplice for so long. At 50, she had finally understood she had betrayed her mother every day she chose not to see the truth. "Do you need help?" she asked with a broken voice. Frank looked at her as if she were a stranger. His own daughter, whom he had protected from the truth for decades, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust he didn't know how to interpret. "Now you talk to me," he grunted while continuing to pack. "Where were you when your mother betrayed me?" The words came out loaded with bitterness, but also genuine confusion. Frank really didn't understand what had happened. In his twisted mind, he had been the provider, protector, head of the family, maintaining order. He couldn't comprehend how his methods had been catalogued as crimes. Harper didn't answer, approached the closet, and began to help in silence. Every movement was mechanical, as if participating in a funeral ritual. It was the first time in her life she helped her father with something, and would also be the last. The two worked in silence for an hour. The only sound in the bedroom was the rustle of plastic bags and the friction of old clothes. It was a symphony of defeat filling the space where screams of terror had once resonated. Margaret didn't appear during the whole process. She had locked herself in the kitchen making coffee no one would drink. It was her way of staying busy while waiting for her personal nightmare to finish packing itself into black bags. From the kitchen window, she saw Betty watering her geraniums for the 5th time that day. The neighbor didn't hide her curiosity. She wanted to witness the historic moment Frank Miller abandoned forever, the house where he had reigned as a domestic dictator. Walter had also come out to water his tomatoes, although it was barely 3 inches the afternoon and the sun was at its highest point. The neighborhood neighbors had informally organized a silent vigil. Everyone wanted to see with their own eyes how the era of violence that had stained their neighborhood for decades ended. At 4 inches the afternoon, Frank dragged the last bag to the living room. His entire life fit in 6 trash bags and a cardboard suitcase he had bought at the market 10 years ago. It was a pathetic inventory for 5 decades of existence. He stood in the center of the living room, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. The armchair where he had watched thousands of football games, the table where he had eaten thousands of meals prepared by trembling hands, the walls that had absorbed thousands of screams of fury and tears of terror. "Where are you going to go?" asked Harper, breaking the silence that had become unbearable. Frank shrugged. He had no plan. For 52 years, he had lived convinced his house, his family, his world of absolute control would last forever. He had never considered the possibility everything could collapse in a single afternoon. "To Larry's house," he murmured, "for a few days, until—" He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't know how to finish it. Until what? Until Margaret came to her senses. Until the judge changed his mind. Until the world returned to the natural order where he had the power. None of that was going to happen, and in the bottom of his bitter heart, Frank knew it. He carried the bags one by one to the door. Every trip was like a small death. His work boots, which had stepped on those floors with authority for decades, now sounded hollow and defeated. On the last trip, he stopped in front of the kitchen door. Margaret was turned away washing dishes that were already clean. Her shoulders looked different. They were no longer hunched by fear. They had straightened with a dignity he didn't remember seeing before. "Margaret," he said with a hoarse voice. She didn't turn around. She kept washing the same plate again and again, as if it were the most important task in the world. Her silence was more eloquent than any speech. Frank waited a few more seconds, perhaps expecting a last word, a look, some sign that 52 years of marriage meant something. But nothing came. Only the sound of running water and the friction of the sponge against the dish. He headed toward the front door where Harper waited with the last 2 bags. Together they went out to the yard, where neighbors pretended to be busy in their gardens while observing every movement with hawk eyes. The cab he had called was waiting at the corner. The driver, a young man who had heard neighborhood rumors, observed the trash bags with poorly disguised curiosity. He didn't see an older man being evicted from his own house by court order every day. Frank loaded the bags into the cab's trunk with slow and heavy movements. Every bag was heavier than it should be, as if loaded with the weight of all his mistakes. Harper stood on the sidewalk, watching her father turn into a stranger, taking his life in trash bags. They didn't say goodbye with words. They just exchanged a look containing 52 years of family secrets that could never be kept hidden again. The cab started with the noise of an old engine. It drove away down the street where Frank had walked as owner and master for decades. Now he moved away like a fugitive criminal, carrying his whole existence in the back seat of a borrowed car. Harper watched until the cab disappeared around the corner. Then she walked back to the house but stopped at the door. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't know if she had the right to enter. Her mother had fought for that house. She had only been a silent witness. From inside came the sound of a door closing, then the unmistakable click of a key turning the lock. It was the most beautiful sound that had resonated in that house in 52 years. It was the sound of freedom securing itself. Closing that door didn't just lock Frank out. It sealed away a lifetime of pain and fear. Now that the shadows are gone, we finally get to witness the beautiful transformation of a woman who is just beginning to live her life. The first thing Margaret did after hearing the cab drive away was walk to the main living room window with deliberate movements. She took the heavy curtains that had kept the house in gloom for years and ripped them from their rails with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The sunlight entered like a golden waterfall, illuminating corners that had remained in shadows for decades. Dust danced in the light rays like little spirits celebrating their liberation. It was as if the whole house had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Margaret opened all the windows of the house one by one. The fresh afternoon air entered, taking away the stale smell of fear impregnating the walls for 52 years. Every open window was a declaration of war against the past and an invitation to the future. In the master bedroom, she stopped in front of the empty closet. The metal hangers hung naked like bleached bones. On impulse, she put her head inside the closet and screamed. It was a primal scream that had been trapped in her throat for decades. The echo resonated in the empty space like a freedom song. She walked to the bed where she had slept terrified for 52 years. The sheets still smelled of the cheap cologne Frank used. Without hesitating, she ripped them off in one pull and put them in a trash bag. Tomorrow she would buy new sheets. Sheets that had never known the weight of a tyrant. The doorbell interrupted her purification ritual. Margaret looked out the window and saw Sarah standing on the porch carrying a bouquet of yellow flowers. Behind her was Betty, with a basket covered by a white cloth. She opened the door with a smile, feeling strange on her facial muscles. It had been so long since she smiled genuinely, she had forgotten how it felt. "How are you, Mrs. Margaret?" asked Sarah, while handing her the flowers. "Free," replied Margaret. It was the first time she used that word to describe herself. The three women entered the transformed house. Betty looked around with inspector eyes, noticing every change. Open windows, torn curtains, light replacing perpetual shadows. "It feels different," commented Betty, while unwrapping her basket. Inside was fresh casserole and a bottle of soda, as if the house were breathing for the first time. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Margaret had served thousands of meals, in fearful silence. Now the table looked different under the natural light entering through the open windows. The scratches and stains that before seemed like scars, now were just marks of a life lived. "Have you heard anything from him?" asked Sarah, while pouring the soda into glasses, shining under the sunlight. Margaret shook her head. "And I hope never to know." They ate in comfortable silence, completely different from the tense silences characterizing that house for decades. This silence was full of peace instead of terror, satisfaction instead of anxiety. The phone rang repeatedly throughout the evening. First, it was Larry, claiming his wife wouldn't tolerate Frank. Then came a call from Linda, Frank's sister, making excuses about her small children. Finally, Harper called, her voice trembling as she relayed Aunt Linda's refusal. To each of them, Margaret gave the same cold, unwavering silence before ending the call. When the phone rang a fourth time, she didn't even check the ID. She simply unplugged it from the wall. The silence that followed was absolute and beautiful. The silence following was absolute and beautiful. Betty and Sarah exchanged looks of admiration. The trembling woman they had known had disappeared, replaced by someone with a steel backbone and the determination of a general in battle. When her guests left, Margaret stayed alone in her transformed house. She walked from room to room, seeing every space with new eyes. It was the same house where she had suffered for decades, but now it belonged to her completely. She stopped in front of the bathroom mirror, the same one where she had seen her swollen face so many times. Her reflection returned the image of a woman healing. The bruises had disappeared. Cuts had healed. Only broken teeth were missing to complete her physical renewal. The phone rang again, but she had unplugged it. Silence was her new companion, and it was infinitely better than any conversation she had had the last 52 years. Outside, the sun began to hide behind the neighborhood buildings. Margaret sat on the porch, something she hadn't done in decades. Neighbors passing by greeted her with genuine respect. She was no longer the battered woman of the neighborhood. She was the woman who had the courage to defend herself. Her cell phone, the one Sarah had helped her buy for emergencies, vibrated with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "Margaret, I'm Gary, Frank's cousin. He's here begging me to let him stay, but my family doesn't want trouble. I just wanted you to know he's bad, very bad." Margaret read the message twice, then deleted the number without replying. Not her problem, not anymore. The days following brought news arriving like unexpected gifts. Every phone call, every chance encounter at the market, every neighborhood rumor painted the same picture. Frank Miller, the man who had terrorized his family for 52 years, had become a pariah no one wanted near. The first news arrived through Nancy Neighbor, who had testified in her favor. She showed up at Margaret's door with a smile she couldn't hide and a pot of chicken stew still steaming. "Did you hear?" she asked, while they sat at the kitchen table, which now remained illuminated by natural light all day. Margaret served 2 cups of coffee in the good cups, the ones she used to use only when important visitors came. Now she used them every day because she had decided every day of freedom was a special occasion. "Hear what?" she asked, although by Nancy's expression, she could guess the news would be satisfying. Frank tried to go to his brother Steve's house in Houston after Linda turned him away, but even Steve kicked him out after 2 days. He told him he didn't want trouble with the law in his house. The information settled in Margaret's chest like warm honey. Steve had been Frank's favorite brother, the only one who had tolerated his outbursts of anger during family gatherings. If even Steve had rejected him, it meant his isolation was complete. "And where is he now?" asked Margaret, surprising herself by feeling curiosity instead of fear. "No one knows. They say he's sleeping in his old truck." The image of Frank sleeping in the back seat of his rickety pickup should have caused her pity, but the only thing she felt was cold and complete satisfaction. It was justice in its purest form. The next day, Betty arrived with even better news. She had met Larry's wife at the market, and the woman couldn't hold back from telling the details of how she had kicked Frank out of her house. She told him if he didn't leave in an hour, she herself would call the police, recounted Betty with evident satisfaction. Imagine, 52 years of being his buddy, and she kicked him out like a mangy dog. They sat on the porch to drink fresh lemonade, something Margaret had never been able to do when Frank lived there. He considered sitting on the porch to be for lazy people and had forbidden the practice for decades. "Do you know what the most beautiful thing about all this is?" said Betty, while watching the neighborhood kids play football in the street. "What?" "That he destroyed himself. No one had to invent lies about him. You just had to tell the truth, and the truth was enough for all the people to reject him." Betty's words contained wisdom Margaret had taken 74 years to understand. The truth had been her most powerful weapon and had been available all along. She just needed the courage to use it. Wednesday afternoon, while watering plants she had bought to decorate her porch, Walter approached with a serious expression. "Margaret," he said, taking off his hat in a gesture of respect, "I wanted you to know Frank came last night. He knocked on my door at 11. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but not from fear. It was pure adrenaline. The sensation of a soldier hearing the enemy approaching, but knowing her defenses are impenetrable. What did he want? For me to give him work in my vegetable business? I told him he was crazy. A man who hits women can't work for me." Walter stayed quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to share the rest of the story. "He looked bad, Margaret, very bad. Skinny, dirty, clothes wrinkled. It looked like he hadn't slept in days." Margaret nodded without showing emotion. It was interesting information, but changed nothing. Frank had 52 years to be different. Now he was reaping exactly what he had sown. "Thanks for telling me," she said while continuing to water her new plants. "Aren't you afraid?" asked Walter with genuine curiosity. Margaret straightened and looked him directly in the eyes. "Afraid of what? He can't touch me anymore, can't scream at me anymore, can't control me anymore. What is he going to do to me? Threaten me from the sidewalk?" The smile accompanying her words was that of a woman who had discovered the monster she had feared for decades was nothing more than a pathetic man without real power. It is profoundly satisfying to watch the community finally step up, proving that Frank's power existed only in the shadows of silence. Now that the truth is out, the monster has shrunk into a ghost. But Margaret's transformation has one final, beautiful chapter left to unfold. That night, while dining alone in her lit kitchen, something unthinkable before, her cell phone rang. It was Sarah. Margaret. I have news that will make your day. What Frank tried to get a job at 3 different places this week, everywhere rejected him when they learned his name. Apparently, news of your case has spread throughout the city. Margaret leaned back in her new chair, the one she had bought to replace the chair where Frank had breakfasted for 52 years. The information was satisfying, but no longer surprised her. It was the natural result of years of abuse finally coming to light. There's something else, continued Sarah. The dentist called this afternoon. Your dentures are ready. The news hit her like a ray of pure joy. New teeth would be the last step in her physical transformation. It would be like being born again, but this time with the wisdom of 74 years and the strength of someone who had conquered her demons. When can I go? She asked, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. Tomorrow at 10 inches the morning. And Margaret, get ready to look beautiful. After hanging up, Margaret looked in the bathroom mirror. Her face had healed completely. Only the smile Frank had broken with his fists was missing to complete. Tomorrow she would have new teeth. Tomorrow she would be completely new. 6 weeks had passed since the sentence. 6 weeks since the judge had closed forever the darkest chapter of her life. Now, in front of the dental office mirror, she was about to recover something he had snatched with his fists. Her smile. Dr. Evans, a gentle man of 50, showed her the finished dental prosthesis. The artificial teeth shone under the fluorescent light like small, perfect pearls. They were white, even, and beautiful. More beautiful than her natural teeth had ever been. Are you ready? Mrs. Margaret asked the dentist with a kind smile. Margaret nodded nervously. Her hands trembled slightly when the doctor began to place the prosthesis in her mouth. She had dreamed of this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, she felt vulnerable like a small girl. The process took several minutes. The doctor adjusted with the precision of a watchmaker. Margaret felt her mouth transforming, recovering a part of herself she thought lost forever. Ready, announced Dr. Evans. Want to see yourself in the mirror. Margaret closed her eyes before turning toward the mirror. It was a moment she had waited all her life without knowing it. When she finally opened her eyes, the woman looking at her from the reflection was a beautiful stranger. Her new teeth transformed her face completely. Lips she had kept closed for years to hide empty spaces now curved naturally upward. For the first time in decades, Margaret smiled without thinking, without calculating, without fear. The smile appearing in the mirror was radiant. It was the smile of a free woman, of someone who had fought against darkness and won. The wrinkles around her eyes deepened, but now they were lines of joy, not pain. My God, she murmured, bringing her hands to her mouth. I don't recognize myself. Dr. Evans smiled behind her. He had seen many transformations in his practice, but few as emotional as this. It wasn't just a matter of new teeth. It was a woman recovering her identity after decades of being lost. You look beautiful, ma'am, he said sincerely. As you should have always looked. Margaret couldn't stop smiling. Every time she tried to put on a serious expression, her lips curved back up automatically. It was as if her face had been waiting 52 years to remember how to express genuine happiness. She got up from the chair and walked toward the office window. Outside, the afternoon sun created long shadows on the sidewalk. It was the same sun that had shone during all the years of her stormy marriage, but now it felt different, warmer, more welcoming. How do I take care of these teeth? She asked, touching her mouth gently. The doctor explained the necessary care while she looked at herself repeatedly in every reflective surface of the office. The table mirror, the window, even the metallic surface of dental instruments. Every reflection returned the same image. A transformed woman. When she left the office, the world seemed brighter. Colors were more vivid, sounds clearer. It was as if she had been seeing life through fogged glass and someone had just cleaned it. In the street, Betty was waiting for her with a group of neighborhood neighbors. Nancy, Barbara, Susan, and Carol were there forming a small, improvised welcoming committee. All had expectant smiles on their wrinkled faces. Let us see, shouted Betty from the distance. Margaret walked toward them with slow steps, savoring the moment. When she was close enough, she opened her mouth and showed them her new smile. The effect was immediate and dramatic. "Oh, good Lord!" exclaimed Nancy, bringing her hands to her chest. "You look like another person. You look gorgeous," added Barbara, clapping with enthusiasm. Words of admiration rained on Margaret like blessings. For over 5 decades, she had heard only insults and criticism. Now these simple neighborhood women saw her as what she really was. "A victorious survivor. I feel different," admitted Margaret, touching her new teeth with the tip of her tongue. "I feel complete." Betty approached and took her by the arm with maternal affection. "You were always complete, my daughter, just that now you can see it." The group of women began walking down the sidewalk, surrounding Margaret like an informal honor guard. Their voices mixed in a symphony of support and celebration. They talked about how beautiful she looked, how brave she had been, how she had inspired other women in the neighborhood. "My sister-in-law is also thinking of reporting her husband," confessed Carol in a low voice. "She says if you could, she can too." The words made Margaret stop dead. The idea that her story could inspire other women to free themselves was something she hadn't considered. During decades, she had believed her suffering was useless, without purpose. Now she discovered it could serve to save others. "Tell her Sarah can help her," she replied firmly. "Tell her she's not alone." They arrived at the door of the house that was now completely hers, the same house where she had suffered for 5 decades, but which had transformed into a sanctuary of peace since Frank had left. Windows were open, curtains moved gently with the breeze, and there were fresh flowers in the small front garden. The neighbors grouped in front of the house, forming an improvised semicircle. It was a moment none of them had planned, but felt completely natural. Betty began to clap slowly, and the others joined until creating a sustained applause resonating through the whole block. Margaret remained standing on the first step of her house, looking at these women who had been silent witnesses of her suffering and now celebrated her victory. The afternoon sun illuminated her face from the right side, creating a golden effect, making her look like a saint in an old painting. The moment called for words, and Margaret knew exactly which ones they were. She straightened, breathed deeply, and spoke with a voice resonating clear and strong through the whole street. "He broke my teeth," she said, pointing to her mouth with a gesture having no trace of shame. "But he will never break my dignity again." The words fell on the group like blessed rain. The applause intensified, mixing with tears of emotion and shouts of approval. Some neighbors hugged each other. Others raised fists in the air as signs of victory. In that moment, Margaret understood completely what she had achieved. Not only had she escaped a violent marriage, she had recovered her voice, her strength, her right to exist without fear. She had demonstrated it is never too late to reclaim one's own life. The sun began to hide behind the neighborhood buildings, painting the sky with golden and pink tones. The golden light bathed Margaret's face, illuminating her new smile and newfound dignity. It was the image of a woman who had gone through hell and come out the other side stronger than ever. The neighbors began to disperse gradually, but not without hugging Margaret one by one. Every hug was a silent promise of continued support, a reminder she was no longer alone in the world. When Betty was the last to leave, she stopped at the door and looked back. "Margaret," she said with a soft voice, "your story doesn't end here, it's just beginning." Margaret nodded, knowing she was right. At 74 years old, she had discovered life could begin again when a woman found the courage to reclaim her power. She stood at her door, watching the sky gradually darken. Somewhere in the city, Frank lived in a borrowed room, alone and defeated, but she no longer thought of him. The future was hers, and shone as beautiful as her new smile. The dignity she believed lost forever had returned home, and this time had arrived to stay. Margaret stood quietly on her porch, allowing the golden sunset to warm her soul. The cold kitchen that once imprisoned her silent tears had transformed into a sanctuary of freedom, now flooded with light and the scent of fresh flowers. Her radiant smile did more than just fill physical gaps. It healed the deep fractures within her heart. Rising from the ashes of 52 years of suffering, she emerged as a resilient, late-blooming flower, proving that it is never too late to reclaim one's life. If you found hope in this emotional true story, please subscribe to the channel to help us spread more messages of courage and resilience to the world.